This is the Crack in the Fence in cooperation with Atlas Sound Money Project. We're today here with John Allison, former CEO of BB&T Bank and now distinguished professor, I should say, of practice at Wake Forest University. Welcome, very glad that we could have you here.
Thank you, thank you.
Let me start. In the book, I Am John Gold, Today's Innovators Building the World and the Villainous Parasites Destroying It, its authors, Laskin and Greta, display you as a disciple of the philosopher Ayn Rand, or actually they compare you with one of the main characters in her most famous novel, Atlas Shrugged. Do you like to be called a disciple of Ayn Rand, or how would you like to be referred to in regards to the philosopher Ayn Rand?
Well, I don't know what the term disciple implies, but Rand's philosophies had a profound impact on my life. And I'm in fundamental agreement with her major ideas. There are obviously areas that I'm in disagreement with, but her core philosophy, I think, is right and important.
So, why would you disagree? If it's like, what kind of issues would you disagree on?
More technical issues. For example, Rand said we shouldn't have a woman president. I don't think that's so. I think we could have a woman president.
Okay, so we're talking about the core principles here. So what kind of core principles, or what are the core principles that you take from Ayn Rand and you take them to guide your own life, your own moral principles, your own decisions? What are the core principles in this case?
Rand said there were three primary virtues: purpose, reason, and self-esteem. Purpose, reason, and self-esteem. By purpose, she recognized that human beings are purpose-driven entities. We have to know where we're going in order to get there. I believe purpose has two fundamental components. First, I believe that the vast majority of people want to make the world a better place to live. However, there are lots of ways to make the world a better place to live. You don't have to go to Africa and feed hungry children. Businesses make the world a better place to live. We provide better products, better services that improve the quality of life. In fact, the main difference between the quality of life in Africa and the quality of life in the United States, we have better businesses. Good doctors, good teachers make the world a better place to live. The second component of purpose, and I think Rand would certainly focus on this, is that each of us has a moral right to our own lives. So we need to make the world a better place to live doing something we want to do for us. In fact, if you were to make the world a better place to live and you didn't enjoy doing it, you will have wasted the most precious thing you have, which is you. And if you try to make the world a better place to live doing something you don't want to do, the odds are you won't do it well. So you need to make the world a better place to live, but doing something you want to do for you. The means by which we accomplish our purpose is our capacity to think. We use the term reason. Everything's alive has a method of staying alive. A lion has claws to hunt with, a deer has speed to avoid the hunter, and we have the capacity to think. And our capacity to think is literally our only means of survival, success, and happiness. And Rand is fundamentally an advocate of rationality, of making logical decisions based on the facts, on avoiding evasion. Evasion occurs when you're presented with some piece of information that at some level you know needs to be examined, but you refuse to examine it because it threatens something you want to believe about yourself, so you don't hear it, and living your life in focus. Interesting thing happens when you're clear about your purpose, when you use your thinking capacity to accomplish your purpose. You get to do something very important. You get to raise your self-esteem. And self-esteem is the foundation for happiness, and happiness is the end of the game. And I mean happiness in the Aristotelian sense of a life well lived, not just a good time on Friday night. But when you're 80 years old, you can look back, yeah, that was a struggle, but I'm glad I did it. That kind of life. And you have to earn self-esteem by living your life with integrity. And you earn self-esteem a lot from your work. Rand is fundamentally an advocate of productive work. And I'll give you a concrete example, something I say many times to the employees of BB&T. It's very important to BB&T that you do your job well, but it's far, far more important to you. You might fool me about how well you do your job. You might fool your boss about how well you do your job, but you'll never fool you. And if you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, give them your level of skill, give them your level of knowledge. You can't do the impossible, but if you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, you will lower your self-esteem. Now here's the good news. Do your work the best you can possibly do it. Give them your level of skill, give them your level of knowledge, and you will raise your self-esteem. And that's more important than whether you get more money or get a promotion, because it's about who you are. So Rand is fundamentally an advocate of purposeful human action, using our thinking capacity, ability to reason, to achieve our own personal happiness, and a high level of self-esteem is the foundation for that happiness.
Isn't that the result of purposeful behavior?
Sure, if we are very purposeful and we do it rationally, then we will raise our self-esteem. So it is all, it's a connected concept.
And how does pride come in? I know from a lot of religious standpoints, or I know from my parents, they used to squash pride a bit. And I never understood it. And how does pride come in this philosophy?
Well, Rand's view of pride, I think, is very similar to Aristotle. In fact, Aristotle said that pride was the greatest of all virtues. Because to have it, you had to be rational, you had to be an independent thinker, you had to be productive, you had to be honest, you had to have integrity. In other words, you had to have all of the right kind of values and the right kind of virtues. And if you think about that, then the role of pride is a psychological reminder to do good and a psychological reward for having done good. And I tell students this, a very important question to ask yourself. The next time you're faced with an ethical decision, would you be willing to tell the people that you value in your life, that you've judged important, not the newspapers, but people that you think are important, what you're going to do and why you're going to do it? If you wouldn't tell the people that you value what you're going to do and why you're going to do it, don't do it. Because you'll always know what you did, and more important, you'll know why you did it. And you always want to be able to be proud of yourself. And Rand saw pride as a virtue in that context. When people attack pride, a lot of times what they're talking about is arrogance. And I think she would define arrogance as irrational, because that's when you think you're better than you are. But earned pride is a very positive attribute.
Yeah, you mentioned applying those practices being a CEO or in your whole life, but let's get to the being a CEO of BB&T Bank for a couple of minutes. You, I would say, have made some notable decisions. Like some other people would definitely say this would be notable. So, for instance, you have said that BB&T would not make loans to commercial developers planning private projects on land seized from private homeowners by local governments. So it seems to me you're putting principles before potential profits here. So don't you, as a business, have shareholders to report to?
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is, in the long term, the principles are what leads to the profits. And we have long disclosed to our shareholders the value system we have at BB&T. And any rational shareholder would have understood why we took the decision we did in regards to the Kelo decision, the abuse of eminent domain that you described. Now, here's an interesting thing. When we made that decision, we knew it was in the long-term self-interest of our shareholders, because we have to have a free society, and property rights are essential for the well-being of the banking system. And if property rights can be abused randomly, which this implied, it would undermine the whole system. But we didn't know what the short-term economic consequences were going to be. Here's the irony. We did lose a few municipal accounts, but we had thousands of people move their checking accounts to BB&T. And they moved it because they didn't agree with the abuse of eminent domain. But beyond that, many of the letters said, wow, we're so surprised a business would act on principle. And we want to do with our business with a bank that will act on principle. And you know, businesses, unfortunately, many have earned the negative belief they'll do anything for a buck. And I think that's bad for their business in the long term. Having the right principles is actually the foundation for profits in the long term.
So you mentioned it's a foundation for long-term profits, but there's plenty of examples of people putting their principles aside, or from a Randian perspective, putting the right principles aside and achieving profits in that sense. Would they be happy in the Aristotelian sense?
Absolutely not, in my view. If you sacrifice rational values, it will always come back to haunt you, and particularly in terms of happiness. I'm an advocate of money, but money is, a lot of business people get confused. They think money's an end. Money's not an end. It's a means to an end. Happiness is the end. And this is what you really grasp when you've made a lot of money, and I'm fortunate enough to have made a lot of money. It is the earning of the money and earning it right that makes it valuable. It's not having it, it's earning it. And that's why people can earn things like they do a great book, and maybe they don't make as much money, but they get more happiness, or they can write a great piece of music. It is the earning process, the creation, the production process that has fundamental value. And yes, you have to make enough money to live, but money is not an end. It's a good thing. In an economic sense, it's a rational reward for productive work in a free society. But the end is the pursuit of creation, of value creation.
So you rule, I get from this a little bit, do you rule out that there's evil men that will not be harmed in their happiness, making the money in a way that is not in accordance with good principles? Is that possible?
Yeah, here's what I have this, as a CEO of a large business, I've met lots of quote successful people. Here's an observation. I have never met anybody that was both successful and happy that I think got there taking advantage of other people. Now, I've met a lot of people, a number of people that have money that I think got there taking advantage of other people. They're always the most unhappy people I have ever met. It is obvious that they don't feel like what they had is earned. And so I've never met anybody that was happy that got there taking advantage of other people. And I've met a lot of them, a lot of people.
Are those people that maybe in hindsight, in private conversation with you, would actually admit this?
Or they would, you can observe it in their behavior, how cynical they are, how negative they are, how lack of sense of purpose they have, how much drinking they do. I mean, you classically see they're alcohol abusers or, get divorced 8 times, which, that there could be other causes for those kind of things. But it's real obvious that they're not happy people, even though they have a lot of money. Okay,
let's go into the one of the other decisions you have made, of course, with your staff. In 2008, you have objected the $700 billion bailout of the financial services industry, of the banks. First of all, out of concern, it might hurt well-run financial institutions such as BB&T. However, just 2 months later, you decided, of course in accordance with your staff, to participate in the TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. Is this a correct description, or what was going on?
Let me tell you what happened. The reason I was opposed to TARP, in addition to lots of technical problems with TARP, is I believe that market corrections are very necessary for long-term economic well-being. Keeping businesses in business that have made bad economic decisions just reinforces the bad behavior and punishes the healthy companies. I'll give you an example to think about this, and you're young, but in early 1980s, Jimmy Carter bailed out Chrysler. It was, quote, considered a successful bailout. Then they failed again, of course. Now the Italians own Chrysler. But here's what people don't realize. If Chrysler had been allowed to fail, what would have happened? The plants would not have gone away, the workers would not have gone away, the resources would have been reallocated to more rational people. And part of the resources might have gone to Ford and General Motors, which would have made them better companies. But more important, what was the psychological lesson they learned when they were bailed out, when the companies were bailed out? They say there's no downside, particularly the unions. We're going to be protected by the government. Therefore, the unions refused to make the kind of changes that would have made Ford and Chrysler successful. In addition, and I happen to be involved in this, a lot of the money would have gone to a private equity group that wanted to start a private U.S. automobile manufacturer that was non-union. The genius of the Japanese is it's not anything but they were non-union. We would now have, I believe, a much healthier automobile industry in the United States led by ABC Automobile Company that would be a non-union company and would be very globally competitive. Now, why did we agree to go with TARP, even though I'm philosophically opposed to it?
Yeah. Unfortunately,
we do not have rule of law in the United States. We have rule of regulators. Our regulators knew that I was opposed to TARP, so the day after TARP passed, I got a call from our regulator, the FDIC, and it was disguised, but this is what the essence of what they say. Regulators always talk in regular but the essence of what they said is, John, BB&T has way more capital than you need based on our long-term capital standards. However, we've decided to change our capital standards. We don't know what the capital standards are going to be, but we're confident that you do not have enough capital unless you take the TARP money. And we've got an audit team ready to come in and certify that you don't have enough capital if you don't take the TARP money. And we said, thank you, we'll take the TARP money. Now, why would they do that? Bernanke, that heads the Federal Reserve, he's a student of the Depression. In the Depression, Roosevelt tried to bail out individual banks and it didn't work. The market jumped on them. There were 3 large banks getting ready to fail, and Bernanke didn't want to bail those individual banks out. But if he could force all the large banks, the $100 billion plus banks, to participate, which is what he did, including the healthy banks, he would obscure what he was doing and make it sound like he was lending money to help banks make loans. So he had to force the large banks, healthy banks, to participate in TARP, and that's exactly what.
Otherwise, it would be a signal to the market that healthy or bad banks were in fact bad banks, and the good banks like BB&T wouldn't take the money and were in good shape.
And here's what's interesting. We didn't need the money. We never had a single quarterly loss. We couldn't possibly need the money. We made profits every quarter. When they did the stress test, we didn't need the money. It was a ripoff for healthy banks because TARP had a very high interest rate, and they took options in our stock. It probably cost BB&T $50 to $100 million. It was to our detriment. So it was just redistribution from the productive to the non-productive banks.
Let's shift gears a bit to the current economic crisis. I found an interesting quote from Ayn Rand that she spoke out in 1961, and I read from her. The world is in a moral crisis, and nothing less than a moral revolution can resolve it. And she goes on to say, we must fight for capitalism, not as a practical issue, not as an economic issue, but as a moral issue. That is what capitalism deserves, and nothing less would save it. Let's go to the crisis of today. Do you think her words are applicable to the crisis that is especially Europe and the US are facing? And isn't it so that we are in an economic crisis or a moral crisis? We'll come back to that later, if you would give that qualification. Isn't that the result of capitalism in the first place? And we have alluded to it already, and maybe you could explain it more.
Right, and let me actually connect the two things together. The primary cause of the current financial crisis is government policy. We don't live in a free market in the United States, we live in a mixed economy. Mixture varies a lot. Technology is probably 20% government, 80% free, and it's been going along well. Financial services is probably 70% government, 30% free. It's not surprising the most regulated industries where we had our problems.
How do you derive those percentages? I'm sorry.
Just from looking at the regulatory cost in the two industries. Okay. Here's what happened. Government policy created a massive misinvestment in the residential real estate market. It was only made possible because the Federal Reserve printed a bunch of money, because Alan Greenspan never wanted to have bad times. He wanted to be the hero. He wanted to be the maestro. And it ended up in the residential real estate market because of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the giant government-sponsored enterprises that never would have existed in a free market. The government guaranteed their debts, which is why they could borrow. They owed $5.5 trillion when they failed, and they had $2.5 trillion in subprime affordable housing loans. They dominated the subprime market. So government policy, really very intentional government, they didn't mean to have the outcome there. The intentional government policy tried to raise the home ownership rate above the natural market rate. It created a massive misinvestment. We built 2 to 8 trillion. It's a long range, but it depends on how you calculate. At least $2 trillion too much housing. Too many houses, too big of houses in the wrong place. We should have been investing in technology, manufacturing capacity, education, agriculture. Housing is particularly bad misinvestment because people don't think about this, but housing is consumption. You consume a house. So we ate our seed corn. And when we borrowed from foreigners, the Chinese and the Japanese, to do that, we're going to have to pay that back. In addition, we taught millions of people how to do the wrong things. We taught them how to build houses. And now they're having to learn a new skill set, which is one reason unemployment is lagging so long. So this was bad public policy. Markets didn't fail. Yeah, a number of banks made mistakes. I'd have let them fail, but they were trivial compared to a conscious government policy. Now, I was going to go to the moral. You want me to connect the two?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. When I talk about this, what I point out is the real cause of financial crisis was ethical, as Rand said, and the real solution is ethical. The real cause of financial crisis was a combination of altruism and pragmatism. Altruism, everybody has a right to a house. Provided by who? Everybody has a right to free medical care. Provided by who? My right to free medical care is my right to imprison a doctor to pay for that medical care, and force somebody else to pay the doctor for me. That is exactly the opposite of the American concept of rights. In the American concept of rights, you have the right to what you produce, what you create. You don't have the right to what anybody else produces, what anybody else creates. altruism in business gets combined with pragmatism, because you can't really be an altruist. You can play lip service and run a few ads, but you can't really be an altruist in a globally competitive market. You'll go broke. So businesses' backup position is pragmatism. And what's the rule in pragmatism? Do what works. Here's the dilemma. Lots of things work in the short term that are incredibly destructive in the long term. Subprime lending worked for years. What's called pick-up payment mortgages worked for years and then became economic disasters. Now here's the interesting thing about being a pragmatist. You can't be rational, because pragmatism says act on today's whim, and rationality requires a long-term perspective. You can't have integrity and be a pragmatist. Integrity says act consistent with principles, but a pragmatist has no principles, so to do what works, right? So you can't be rational and you can't have integrity. You combine pragmatism with altruism and you get something I call the free lunch mentality. Last presidential election, neither candidate offered any solution to Social Security and Medicare, and if they had, they wouldn't have been elected, right? The free lunch mentality, unfortunately, leads to a lack of personal responsibility, and a lack of personal responsibility is the death of democracies. The Founding Fathers talked about the tyranny of the majority, but what they were talking about the abuse of individual rights and freedom of speech, but what they really recognized is that 51% of the people figure out they can vote a free lunch from 49%. Pretty soon the party's over, because 60% want a free lunch from 40%, and 70% want a free lunch from 30%, and finally the 30% quit. And so that is a moral crisis, and Rand described it in a much more sophisticated way, but that's the basic idea. And interesting enough, the cure is in Rand's philosophy, but it's very consistent with what made America great: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each individual's moral right to their own life, including the right to the product of their own labor. If they produce a lot, they get a lot, including the right to give it away if they choose to. Interestingly enough, that demands personal responsibility because there is no free lunch. It also demands and rewards rationality and self-discipline. And if you think about the United States, when you think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it was the first country ever based on the idea that people should act in their rational self-interest, because that's what the pursuit of happiness is. In the context of what Rand calls the trader principle, that means you don't try to take advantage of other people. That's actually self-destructive, but you don't self-sacrifice either. That life is really about getting better together. It's about trading value for value. In our business, we help our clients be economically successful. They let us make a profit doing it. We get better together. And life is really about creating win-win relationships. There are only two stable relationship conditions: win-win and lose-lose. And life is about creating win-win relationship conditions. And that's the principle that actually underlies a free society and free markets. And that is an ethical question.
So, in a nutshell, the majority of Americans have forgotten to be responsible human beings. Or I'm not talking about Americans only, I know in Europe.
Yeah, whether it's the majority is an interesting question, but a lot. A lot of people want a free lunch. And this really is a battle over personal responsibility. That is the fundamental question here. And when people advocate their personal responsibility, and when you create incentive systems for people to advocate their personal responsibility, your society ultimately fails economically.
Let's get more into the monetary issues.
Okay.
Let's see if we can ask some questions here. You mentioned the behavior of the Fed manipulating credit markets, driving interest rates down as one of the causes of the crisis. So what do you think, maybe you can go from Randian perspective, Randian moral perspective, what is your take on the legitimacy of this institution?
I think
the central bank, the Federal Reserve.
I think the Federal Reserve has done more damage to the U.S. economy and the global economy than anybody except the U.S. Congress. I think the Federal Reserve is a very destructive institution. Something that people forget is from 1870 to 1913, the United States had no central bank. We had a huge improvement in the standard of living. We integrated millions of people that were the rejects of the world and we had no central bank. The Fed was created in theory to reduce volatility. What they do in practice is reduce volatility in the short term and create bigger problems in the long term, because they don't let markets correct. They don't let businesses fail. It's like not disciplining your children. You get the long-term consequences. If I were in charge, I'd get rid of the Federal Reserve. That would be one of my first moves. I would create a private banking system with a market-based monetary standard that would probably be gold. The magic in gold is not that gold is magical, but the magic in gold is you can't print it, right? And the temptation for politicians of any political party is to print money and buy votes. And they've been doing it for thousands of years, And it's always led to economic disaster, and they've been doing it again. And they're doing it today. And so I think the Fed is a very dangerous institution, not because there aren't smart people and there aren't good intentions. They just are unfortunately influenced by the political environment and do some very long-term damaging things because the purpose of money is to have a standard of value that you can rely on. And when somebody can just arbitrarily print it, you have a yardstick of 36 inches one day and 25 the next, and you can't do economic calculation, and it really is very destructive to economic well-being.
You mentioned gold very briefly. I know Ayn Rand is a defender of gold, but not per se, I would say. How does she why is she so positive about gold? And is there a possible defense from a moral angle, from her first moral principles for gold, or for a standard close to it?
Yeah, what Rand recognized is that the purpose of money is to be a reliable standard of value that couldn't be manipulated, that couldn't be used to abuse and deceive people, which a central bank can by just printing money. And so she thought that was important, that if in a free market, that somebody that earned wealth would be able to retain that wealth because they'd have a reliable standard of value. She wasn't an advocate of gold, as a pretty metal, but as and by the way, gold has been selected over thousands of years, and there were many other alternatives. So it's not just a random standard of value. It's hard to find, it's expensive to find, but it grows almost at the right rate by chance. I mean, it grows at about the right rate, and as a measure of value, it's been very stable for long periods of time.
So gold is emerging out of the free market so therefore she would be an advocate of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an issue, I don't really agree with this, but a lot of people that are investing in gold, they're not speculators in the normal sense of the word. They think that paper currencies are going to collapse because they believe if you really run the numbers on the United States, you really run the numbers on Europe, we cannot fulfill our commitments, in real dollars. So what we're going to do is print a bunch of money, and we might pay Social Security, but the money you get's not going to buy you anything. And they see that, and so they think that paper currencies may collapse. And they're investing in gold, not in the normal speculation like you do in soybeans, but in the belief that paper currencies may go. I don't think they'll go in the short-term future, but I think there's a legitimate issue there.
So, if you look at the gold price today, does it really reflect or silver or other precious metals? Does it really reflect where you think the US is heading towards, or are a lot of Americans or people around the world still oblivious about what is going to happen?
I don't know the answer to that. I think the price is probably a little exaggerated and probably should be somewhat lower. But I think in terms of direction, it definitely is the right direction based on the actions today. Now, there's always hope that we'll change direction. Now, here's the good news, is that we can fix our financial problems if we have the will to do it. The bad news is if we don't change direction, in 25 years, it's mathematically certain the United States goes broke. We have over $100 trillion unfunded liability under Social Security, Medicare, government pension plans. It just won't work. But it's mathematically possible, but it takes discipline. So gold is a bet, it's really a bet that politicians don't have the discipline to deal with our problems. And that's probably a pretty legitimate bet, but there's a possibility that we'll have the courage. And I think Rand is the key, because her ideas are what are essential to changing direction, and mostly her ethical ideas. The defense of rational self-interest, the defense of the personal pursuit of happiness. That is a battle we have to win, because if you don't believe people have the right to their own life, the answer is, quote, socialism, even though in fact it leads to a much lower standard of living. So you have to be willing to defend the right of each of us to the moral pursuit of our personal happiness, not taking advantage of other people, not cheating and lying and stealing and those kind of things. But that's what Rand saw that most people don't see, even conservatives.
That comes now full circle, where we talked about this crisis being a moral crisis, and also now the moral education, or going back to those sound, good Randian principles, would actually lead us out of this recession, rather than economic analysis or academics or it becomes like an issue from the regular American or regular European, whoever.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
This is really an ethical battle.
On that note, thank you very much, John Allison. I think we've run our course in time.
Very good.
Thank you very much. It
Yes,
was my
sir.
pleasure.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Have a great day.